Hello and welcome. My name is Alex Zucker. I'm a translator from Czech and a member of the Translators Collective Cedilla and Company. We're delighted to be collaborating with the Center for Fiction to bring you this monthly series, and we're grateful for the Center's support. These translation clinics, as we're calling them, are intended as knowledge-sharing open sessions for translators and lovers of translation from all backgrounds and experience levels, as well as the translation curious, as I like to say. Each month, we invite a different literary translator to present on or discuss a subject of their choice with a Cedilla member, followed by a Q&A with attendees. Topics will range from questions and theories of craft to submissions, contracts, and other practical concerns, always with an eye to literary translation as a profession. Attendees are encouraged to bring questions from their own practice. Today, I am delighted to say that we have the good fortune to hear from Sora Kim Russell, a translator from Korean. Her recent publications include Pyun Ha-young's The Law of Lines, Hwang Sok-young's At Dusk, and Kim Un-soo's The Plotters. Sora has taught literary translation at the Breadloaf Translators Conference in 2018, LTI, that's the Literary Translation Institute Korea, and Yuha Women's University. Her forthcoming publications include 2 co-translations, The Prisoner by Hwang Sok-young and On the Origin of Species and Other Stories by Boyoung Kim. I will also add that in 2017, her translation of The Whole by Ha-young Pyun won the Shirley Jackson Award, which is given for outstanding achievement in the literature of psychological suspense, horror, and the dark fantastic. And I personally want to recommend that novel to everyone. So tonight, which is tomorrow morning, where Sora is, joining us from Seoul, Sora will be talking about co-translating, including her own experiences with it, her thoughts on the differences between translating and editing, how contracts play a role in determining what counts as translation, and more. These sessions are being recorded and are available for later viewing, and live captioning is available. You can click on the CC button on the bottom menu for the different options. We invite you to turn your camera on if you like and settle in for the conversation, during which everyone except me and Sora will be muted. Feel free to add comments and questions in the chat, which tonight will be moderated by Cedilla member Sean Bai, a translator from Polish. For the second half of the session, we'll open the conversation. And so if you're comfortable speaking on screen, raise your hand either by clicking at the bottom of the participants list or by using the reactions button. And you'll be invited to unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself. But if you prefer Sean to read the question for you, just send it privately to Cedilla in the chat. We'll try to get to all of them, but I apologize in advance if we end up running out of time. For those who are unable to attend our live events, we encourage you to email questions or comments before or after the sessions to translationclinics@centerforfiction.org. We hope to make these conversations ongoing to include viewers in as many time zones as possible. And now we're going to dive right in. So want to start by asking Sora, how did you get into literary translation?
Sure. Yeah. So how I got into it, it has a lot to do with why this topic came up for me. When I first started translating anything at all, I was here working in Korea as an editor, editing academic translations. And the way that was set up was basically what you'd call a bridge translation. So we would get the essays from professors, and then a hidden translator somewhere would do the draft translation, a rough draft from Korean to English, and then send it in, and then a team of editors would go over it. And we had a Korean editor who would be looking at it against the original, and then English editors who were working only in the English and working that way. And then as I was doing this work, I found every now and then, and increasingly over time, I'd find myself wanting to go back to the original to see what was there, and finding that maybe things that we'd really been wrestling with in editing was like, you know, you go to the original and go, oh, okay, that's what they're trying to say. And I found myself really enjoying that process more than the editing, being able to go back to look at the original and play around with how things were drafted. At the same time, I was doing my own writing. I was writing poetry and dabbling in fiction. And I thought, a friend of mine basically said, why aren't you doing literary translation instead of academic? So I decided, why not? Let's jump in. And luckily that year, you mentioned the LTI, the Literary Translation Institute. That was the first year that they had workshops. They started running courses. And so I joined the course, and in the classroom as well, and I think this was just a time management issue, there as well, it was group translation. So instead of working solo, we would work together in mixed groups of Korean and English speakers, whichever language was your stronger language. And so all that coursework was working together in this way. And so it was only after that that I started venturing more into solo projects. And let me know if I'm jumping too far ahead or talking too fast, but even after that, so again, this is all based here in Korea. When the first small projects that I got for literary translation, like short stories or other kinds of text, were mostly through LTI. They would sponsor different projects and then hire us on. And they wouldn't have us do co-translation per se, but we would always be paired with an editor. And it was usually matched to whatever our weakness was. So like for me, even though I'm biracial Korean American, I didn't start learning Korean until later in life. And so my big concern is always accuracy and what am I missing in the source text. And so they would pair me with a Korean editor to go over my work. And so my model coming into this was really this collaboration and almost a kind of policing sometimes of like, of being challenged on my work and making sure that, that I wasn't taking liberties just for the hell of it, but that I had to be able to justify those choices that I was making in translation. So that's how I got into it. And like I said, that's how I kind of arrived at this question. It was a little bit later in the process that I found myself questioning, like at the same time that I appreciated all this rigor that I was exposed to, I did have concerns about the process and like the way that we were paired up, assumptions that were made when we were paired up, and what the end result was on our work. And so that started raising lots of questions in my head about how we work together when we work on translations. I'll pause there.
Yeah, there's already hours of conversation in there. Two questions coming out of that. One is maybe it would be helpful again, because, you know, we have people who are possibly thinking about getting into translation or early in translation, getting into translation. How many years ago did you start, when you moved from editing to translating together with other people? And how many years before you translated your first, I don't know, I don't want to say anything alone, but longer piece alone?
Yeah, I hold on. I want to like pull up my CV because it's been at least 10 years. I want to say my first big solo project, the first novel was, I think that was 10 years ago. And the way too that it worked, I mean, so the group work really ended with the course. After that, it was solo work with the editors. The thing about it is that even though I did have this person I was working with, my name was the only one that ever went on the manuscripts, and there was never like an edited by or other citation, and it was, or violet credit, and it was for the most part, editing in the sense that they would make their comments and then give it back to me. And then I had a choice of whether to accept or decline those changes. And different editors had different degrees of involvement. I did have one kind of odd project where the editor declared to me that they would have final say over all of the changes. But their name wasn't on it. It was only my name, and they were making changes that I disagreed with. And that was one of those projects that made me really feel like this system there's something, it's a good idea, but not always a good execution because of the authority that they were asserting over it without naming themselves. And I felt like if you're going to be the one to finish a translation, then you should have your name on it so that the responsibility gets shared. I'm losing track of the question. Oh, how long ago was this? So the first project, it depends. There were short stories that I did on my own, but the first novel length work was I'll Be Right There by Shin Kyung-soo. And that was one where, because it was through the publisher and the agent, I didn't have the editor assigned to me by LTI. And so for that project, I basically hired a friend to go through my draft and check it against the original.
And to be clear, you mentioned this one translation where the editor asserted that they had the final say over it rather than you. Was that for a book that was being published by a publishing house?
No, it was actually subtitles for a play.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah. It was
so
really,
I mean, that's important for people to know because as somebody who's spent a fair amount of time doing advocacy around contracts, I just think it's important to say in the midst of all of this that who gets credit for what is one of those things that is determined in a contract. So
exactly.
Come back to that, but just to let people know that is something that is laid out in the contract. It's not just made up after the fact or on the spot. So, so maybe one of the things that you and I spoke about in preparing for this conversation was then to try to define, not definitively, but what really is the difference between editing and translating, or where can the line be drawn, or where would you draw it, or what are the different places it can be drawn?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it would be nice to be given an answer. To some respect, I think, I think it's a subjective thing on some level, because I think the way that we translate, the way we experience translation, and the way we sort of divide the stages of translation up in our heads can be really different. Like for me, the way that I work, there's a lot of slippage between the drafting of the translation, which can feel very mechanical, where you're just moving the words from Korean to English, and then the stages of revision, where for me at least, I go back to the source text a lot. I retranslate a lot. I retool things. And so, and then even into the editing stages, even after I've declared to myself that, okay, I'm putting the original away and I'm not looking at it, I still go back all the time. So I never really feel like I leave the source text in the way that we sometimes say that you should. And even with editing, like with every project, I tell myself I'm not going to do it again. And then I do it again, where I hound the editors up until the book goes to print to like, hold on, please change this. Hold on, change that. I just figured this out. So for me, a lot of these translation breakthroughs, where I'm figuring things out, figuring out how all the pieces of the book fit together or how it should sound, it's happening continuously through all of the stages. And for me, I find it difficult to say that that's not translation or that the translating has stopped. Whereas I know for other people, and having worked on co-translations, I've realized that that's not everyone's experience, and that for others it may be more clean cut, or yeah, and particularly when you start dividing the roles up or delegating parts of it, that maybe it's not correct to call all of it translation, that there should be some sort of line between these categories. So I'm still floundering. I'm still struggling with how to define all of this, especially like you said, when it gets into contracts and credit and who did what amount of work, it gets really tricky. It's really difficult. And a lot of other stuff kind of gets pulled into the conversation that you might not anticipate going into a project. Yeah.
Just to make sure it doesn't get lost, since the whole thing is built about a co-translation. I know we're talking about editing. It may not be as clear, but I know that there was one book in particular that you wanted to talk about as a translating project. Maybe you can talk about that now.
Sure. So I did the 2 co-translations, and I did them the same way. So normally when we talk about co-translation, the assumption is that you're dividing the work by pages. So if you have a short story or a book, you divide pages and chapters. You each do half, and then and then from there, whatever, maybe swap the pages or fist fight over how to revise it. I don't know. For these projects, I took the approach I took, and the reason I took this approach is I had agreed very early on to these 2 books, and then got pregnant. And then when the translations needed to begin, I was very close to my due date. And so I had to figure out what to do with these projects. Do I cancel the contracts and say no? Do I try to put another translator on the project instead of me? Or do I postpone? And postponing wasn't an option. They wanted to get the project started. And so the solution that I thought of was, maybe I can work with a co-translator who will do the drafting, the first part of it, and then do the rough draft, and then I can come in and take care of the revisions, any retranslation, and working with the editors. And initially with both projects, I had approached someone that I was mentoring. So I thought this would be a great way to basically bring her onto a paid project and vouch for her so that she could sort of get a leg up into the industry. And then with one of them, and I'll talk more about the one that we ended up working on all the way to the end. That was a short story collection on the origin of species through Kayapas. That was a really interesting project because it really pushed, for me at least, the idea of how collaborative a project can be and where these lines were, because the editing was very intense as well, and really became rewriting. With the other projects, we ended up, there were changes of translators. And so in the end, it was more, I guess, done for, well, I don't want to get too much into that one, but I ended up working with a different person, but I want to say about that. With that one, it was, yeah, I don't know. We had a contract for that one. So part of the thing that was tricky with Kaya Press is that I had signed the contract in advance as a solo translator. So when I brought her on, Chongmin, my co-translator, she was a subcontractor. And so there wasn't a lot that I could do as far as changing her legal relationship to the project. Whereas with the other book, we signed the contract after establishing the co-translation relationship. And so in some ways it was more clear cut. In other ways, still sort of messy, is again, figuring out where all these roles began and ended. Should I pause or keep going?
Yeah, no, that's okay. So as far as the crafting of the translation goes, the actual translating process though, so with the short story book, you say you divided up the pages, so you each took, or no?
Well, initially we tried to divide the stories, and then I kept running into, I was just having trouble keeping up because new baby. And so we ended up, the drafts that I did have, which were very messy, I handed over to her. And then the stories that had not yet begun, I just pretty much handed them over as well. So she, in my mind, she did the whole rough draft of the collection. And then handed that, when I was ready, she handed it off to me. And then I went through and did the revisions. And at the time, you know, I'd mentioned bridge translation at the beginning, and I didn't really get into it. I have a lot of criticism actually of bridge translation, having seen how it works and what sort of the politics of it are, especially here in Korea. With this project, it maybe stupidly didn't occur to me that it was a kind of bridge translation, because I was only coming in at the revisions and editing. And I think I didn't think of it that way because I knew that I would be looking at the original, and I knew that there would be a lot of possibly very big changes that I might be making. And so it only occurred to me late in the process that maybe this was not exactly a co-translation, that maybe there was some other term that we could be using. And so, yeah, again, it was, she did the draft. She was new to translation, and her work was excellent. But she was new enough that she was leaning on me to be a mentor, to give her feedback. And so the edits, ultimately the changes, I was in charge of the final changes, and that was the request of the publisher. They were, because when I'd approached them about doing it as a co-translation, they basically said, it's fine as long as you guarantee how the book is going to look in the end. And so I knew that I would be having to do all those final revisions. Where am I going with this?
Can I pause to ask a question? Yeah. I know you mentioned briefly earlier in our conversation, you did briefly define what bridge translation was, but maybe people may have missed that. Could you remind people, or maybe just elaborate slightly on what that actually means?
So a bridge translation, the idea is that you have, when you have a source text, you have a speaker of that language who produces what we would call a literal translation, or I guess a trot is another term for it, where it's just, without much sort of stylistic intervention, it's translated very much as it appears in the original, maybe with annotations or multiple word choices. And then another person who does not speak the source language and cannot read the source text then revises and edits. That's my understanding of it. And here, the models that I saw in Korea, they did see examples of people doing bridge translations where you would have couples, for example, either, I don't know, well, we won't get into the more personal dimension of it, but I saw both that and co-translation, where both people are reading the source text and referring back to it, but they maybe, again, divide the roles up. And so, like I said, I hadn't thought of it in terms of a bridge translation because I knew that I would be looking at the original throughout.
I think, to return to one of the questions that we posed or that you posed for the description of the event on the website, what is the difference between editing and translation? We could say that a person who's, whether they are doing the first draft or not, that somebody who is revising a translation while looking at the text and the language being translated can still be said to be translating, whether or not they're defined as an editor or a translator. Would you agree with that?
After a lot of wrestling with it, that was sort of where I landed, because like I said, the process with these two books, it got me really questioning all of this stuff. And either it's translating or it's some other word that we haven't invented yet. And part of that, so one of the issues that we ran into was that the word editing or edited by, it was sort of bloated in a way that translated by wasn't, because to edit something can carry many different meanings. And for example, with the short story collection, when I had approached the publisher to ask whether, well, first of all, I asked my co-translator if she was okay with the byline, and her reaction was kind of just like, what are you talking about? Of course it's a co-translation. Like it wasn't an issue there. And then with the publisher, I don't know, I kind of got this, I got the sense that, well, even aside from the contractual language that was in place, pretty much there wasn't really room for another term. Like if we had wanted to change it to an editing byline, there already was an editor credit. and an editor's note. Those roles had, like you alluded to, they'd sort of been defined ahead of time. And so to change, if I had wanted to change the credit, it still would have had to be some variation on translation, on the word translation. There weren't a lot of other words available within the space of the book, if that makes sense. And then really quickly, you asked where the line lies. That's something I was trying to work up to it, and then I got lost along the way. This was something that when the question came up for me, and when I started approaching both co-translators and the publishers to ask, what is the appropriate language here? One of the things that was on my mind is like, as a co-translator or for someone in my position, if I'm revising, is there like a certain percentage of the text that I should have changed for it to become a translation as opposed to an edit? Like, do I need to do a word count, of version A and version B? I really was sort of hoping to find something more concrete, like a way to really say, okay, I've stepped over the line. Or likewise with editing, because I mentioned one of with the editor at Kaya, she did an amazing job on one of the short stories that we had translated, where we had, just to talk about it really quickly, because it's kind of interesting in its own way. One of the stories, there's no reference to gender. The characters are all robots. And there are a couple of places in the text where it's made explicit that this is not, the binary sex is not a concept that they have. Now, translating it in Korean, you can do this. You can write a story without directly defining the gender of a character, and it doesn't even stand out. It just seems very natural in the Korean. But English, not so much. And we had really wrestled with how to do this, how to make the language work, on top of which there were descriptions of robots and names of robots that seemed to indicate a male or female assignment. And so we're, really stuck on this. And the editor came in and did a rewrite, start to finish, where she made it work. And I told her in all seriousness, like, add your name to the byline. Because to me, I felt like that was more than editing. Yeah.
That's a great example to start or get people's minds churning about these questions. And we're a little past the halfway point, and already amazing, right? We're on the Concord here. So we're ready to take questions from people, and I'm sure people are going to want to dig into different parts of what you talked about. So Sean, again, there's so we invite you to turn your camera on if you like. To repeat, if you're comfortable speaking on screen and you want to ask your question to us showing your face, you can raise your hand either by clicking at the bottom of the participants list or by using the reactions button, and you'll be invited to unmute your microphone and ask the question yourself. You can also ask without turning on your camera and ask the question yourself. I want to make clear that's an option. Or if you prefer for Sean to read your question for you, just send it privately to Cedilla in the chat. So what have we got? Who's first?
We have a question from Julia here. She says, I found a lot of resistance from publishers when I suggest co-translating a book with a colleague. Where do you think this resistance/suspicion comes from? Does it trouble the notion of authorship too much, or is it something much more practical?
That's a really, really good question. I think it's all of the above. I know that in my case, so for example, with the Hwang So-kyung autobiography, one barrier that I ran into with bringing on a co-translator is that, so I had translated 3 books by Hwang So-kyung and was asked to do the autobiography. And when I approached his agent about whether I could work with someone, her big concern was, will it sound the same? She wanted the voice to be consistent across all the books. And this is a really long book. It's a 1,000-page book. I had a baby on the way. I was like, look, it might not sound the same even if it's me. And so it took a lot of pushing, and it was kind of like like with the Kaya press book, I kind of had to just personally guarantee that everything was going to be fine, that the quality would be there. The co-translators I worked with, they didn't have to audition for the work. They didn't have to submit samples or anything. It was pretty much, I got to parachute them in. And so I think there was anxiety on the publisher's part because of that. So there was that resistance. And then and then with authorship, that was the case with the Haunts and Hound, because like I said, they sort of saw it as like, I had produced this certain voice and they wanted that same voice. With Kaya Press, it was more the legality of it because we had already drawn up the contract. This was something that I had meant to mention. So I made sure that her name got in the byline, Jungmin, my co-translator, and I made sure that it was first. And when and there were some other little things too, like the publicity material, like the blurbs that we had only mentioned me. And I think that was just the timing of when everything went out. And so when we were going over the proofs, there were a lot of things where I had to say, look, like it can't only be my name. Like that's weird. And so we would sort of change the wording here and there. I mean, I don't think for one moment that was Kaya Press saying, you know, like, no, we're gonna step on this translator. It was practical issues. It was legal issues. Like with the copyright, I really pushed to change that to have her name added with mine. But that was something that they just simply couldn't do because it had been signed off on way too early. And then as far as the practical side, in this particular case, I think they understood in my case because it wasn't an issue of like, I don't get the book or I don't read Korean or whatever. It was, I'm gonna be offline for 3 months or more, and you can either get the book late or you can get it on time. And so in terms of the practicality, it wasn't as big of an issue. But for sure, the issue of authorship, the legal questions of how do we drop the contract, those were definitely both factors.
Next question.
We have a question from Lola, who asks, has the cost of subcontracting been an issue for you? How did you afford it?
Also a good question. In this case, well, this is where we have this luxury of translating from Korean because we have very generous support from the Korean government. And so with my co-translators, we split the translation grant that we received. And so that was pretty straightforward. And then with, in cases where I've hired readers or editors to go over my work, where they're not credited, I would still give them a percentage of whatever grant that I had received. So being able to hire people or subcontract was contingent on me having that financial support. I don't know if it's a case where, say, I want to pitch something, if I don't have the funds to just hire someone outright, then usually what we do is a work exchange where I'll read a short story in exchange for edits on a short story. And for a lot of people, a lot of my fellow translators here, depending on our schedules, that's what a lot of us will choose to do, is to sometimes that feedback is worth more than the percentage that's going to come your way.
So you're offering to read a translation of somebody else's and comment on it? Is that what you mean by read?
Exactly. So like, so recently I worked with someone where I translated a short story for publication and offered to pay her to go over it and comment. But she said, how about you just read one of my short stories instead? Because she had a translation that she was prepping for publication or to send out to magazines. And so I gave her feedback, and then we also talked about where she could send it. And so we did a work exchange that way. Otherwise, if I were pitching a work and didn't have access to that, I don't know that I could afford it. I think I would have to just do it on my own and hope for the best, because it's a lot to ask of other people. It's a lot of work.
I love the idea of the work exchange. I haven't had occasion to do that yet, but I definitely will keep it in my arsenal. Next question.
I think we have a question from Evan who has his hand raised. Evan, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. I was wondering if you've ever co-translated with the original author of the book, because one of the projects I'm working on, I've gotten a lot of feedback from the original author.
I have, and now I don't know how much to say about it. I did once. Oh, whatever, I'll be honest. I did once and I did not enjoy it. It's really different when you're working with someone, because I mentioned like the idea of authority and who has the final say, and like even with these co-translations that I did, even though I had the final say, I really tried my best to keep my co-translators' voices in the text and to not just like change things just because it wasn't how I would do it, but to sort of have us both heard. The one time that I did work with an author, it was really challenging because obviously it's his work. He had very strong opinions about how it should appear. And I realized I didn't like working under those constraints. And granted, it was early on, and it was right at the time when I was really sort of pushing against the group translation and the co-translation models that I'd started out in. And I really wanted to be the author of my own translation in a way. And so I found it difficult. And I ended up with that one, I think I just walked away from it. I think I just said, go ahead, here's my work. You don't even have to pay me or put my name on it. I'm out of here.
Yeah, I will say this is, again, one of those areas where it's important if you are signing it, this is a book or any project that as a translator, you're signing a contract to do your best to ensure that the contract states what role, if any, the author will or will not have in reviewing your translation, because when there's nothing in there about it, it can be tricky. I myself have not ended up in one of those situations, so I don't have anything personal to share about it, but I have heard stories. All right, next question.
We have a related question from Jeffrey. Have there been conflicts with co-translators? What strategies have you used to alleviate those conflicts?
Okay, so, well, really early on, the conflicts were sort of just like disagreements over the text. How did they get resolved? I don't know if I even remember. I mean, I think in those cases, they were sort of like practice texts anyway, because it was for class or what have you. And once we sort of got out of the classroom and broke off into solo translation, it was less of an issue because you could argue and then go back to your desk and the thing you were working on was yours. More recently, the biggest issue was, again, with how to credit work and whether to call things co-translation, whether to call it translated by, edited by, whether to do something completely different. And I was searching for other types of phrasings, like what does it mean if we say translated by A with B, or with the collaboration of B, or like I was like testing every preposition to see what can I do with under the umbrella of translation. And then if we do go with edited, what does edited imply in terms of who did what kind of authority was held over the text, and how does that collide with the other editors in the project? So, so like with the short story collection, there's the person who compiles the stories and they're the editor. With the autobiography, it was a shortened version of the text. And so there was the person who made those final decisions about how to abridge the text, and they were an editor. It was really difficult. And in that case, the conflict, it was resolved by the contract, because the contract had this language in place and the publisher said, this is the language that we're going to follow. And so it was, the conversation sort of just ended where it ended. So it's, in some respects, it was unresolved philosophically, but resolved legally, if that makes sense.
I will say that the first published book translation I ever did, I was asked to edit somebody else's translation, and when it was given to me by the publisher, I said, I started working on it and I said, it's clear to me that the number and type of changes I'm going to make, it's going to be a retranslation. I can't just revise their translation. And the publisher, I spoke about it with the publisher, I spoke about it with the author's son, who was the one who was basically representing her, the author. And I got a green light to do that. And then the book was printed, and in the interest of maintaining good relationship with the original co-translators of the book, it was a co-translation to begin with, and then I was brought in because the author's son and the author were not satisfied with it. The original credit on the cover said translated by Alex Zucker with these other two people's names, but when the other two people saw the cover, they made a really big stink about it, and the editor called me up to ask, if I wanted to insist on it or not. And actually, it was Susan Harris before she was editor of Words Without Borders when she was at Northwestern University Press. That's how I met Susan Harris, over the phone. And it was my first translation, so I was happy just to even be involved. And I said, no, I'm not going to, it's fine. And so but they had to pulp the run, which cost them a lot of money. They had to pulp the run, and they reprinted it with the credit, in all three of our names in alphabetical order. So I'm Zucker, so I was last. So.
Yeah. Going back to that same question really quickly. So part of my concern with the edited line was because of scenarios like what you're describing. I had only seen edited by as, what do you call it, attached to a translated by in situations where something had gone wrong with the translation and it had to be like fixed or rescued by someone else. I hadn't seen situations where that wasn't a case. And it doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that I don't know. And I still don't know if that should have been the way that we cited it. But one of the things with this issue of like conflicts and how we alleviated it. So my concern going in to these projects, I really wanted my co-translators to have their name first, so that in any like online sales listings, whatever, that their name, the link to their name is what pops up first. And with the pay, things like that, I was very concerned with how to keep it fair, because going into it, it wasn't just that the publishers on both sides had said, you have to make the final choice. This has to be your voice on the translation. The other factor is that, it was mentioned in my bio that I've taught for, I'm not teaching now, but I've taught literary translation for a long time. Long enough that most of my colleagues are former students, whether briefly or long term. And there's a power relationship there, that if I'm working with someone who was my student, that's something I have to be very, very aware of and very careful of. It can come up in the context of like arguing over a text, like, are they going to be willing to argue with me about a choice that we made? Or is it going to be that I make this call because I'm the teacher. And I don't think that I did it as well as I could have, but it was something that worried me throughout the process. At the same time that it was a little bit deliberate in that I wanted to bring them into the industry and say, here's a paid project, learn how it happens. I didn't want this it bothered me that I had to be the final say. I mean, it made it easier in some ways. You resolve conflicts by saying, well, I'm in charge, but it's a little icky too, in that you have to do that. That said, and I want to give a shout out to my co-translator, because I'm pretty sure she's still lurking in here. One of the things that I really appreciated about working with Chelmeen is that even though she was brand new and I was her mentor, she had no fear about saying, no, you're wrong. This is what the text says. She told me that I threatened to call her out today, and she threatened to cut me. So I'll leave it at that. She can stay anonymous in the group chat. But But again, that was something that it was kind of a relief for me that to see that even though I was as concerned as I was about the power relationship, it didn't necessarily determine everything about the process.
Another question?
We have one from Julia who says, I wonder if your concerns with how to appropriately refer to the work that goes into translation/editing, the balance of it when one thing becomes another, has anything to do with how insufficient the term translation is in explaining what we do?
It's a really good question. Probably, yes. I think that's part 2 of this event of what the heck is it that we do? Because I think that there is a sense that what we do is mechanical. Like, you know, I think what's coming to my mind now are all the times when I've been asked to translate something overnight or in just way too short of a time. And it's like, do you even understand what's involved? Like, we're not Google Translate. We're not machines. There's a process and it takes time. And so I do think there is, a lack of understanding with the term. And it was something that when I was prepping for this, I was thinking so much about how when we say translation, it has such a narrow definition compared to writing, revising, editing, all these very bloated words that almost have too many meanings attached to them. And and I could probably go off on a whole nother rant too, going back again to how translation is seen as a mechanical act. And I kind of alluded briefly to why I'm uncomfortable with bridge translation. And specifically, I'm especially uncomfortable with it when it comes to Asian languages, because this is again in a whole nother event, but it sort of collides with or aligns with certain ideas about what Asian translators are able to do in certain languages and what they should be limited to doing. And that was one of the things that made me very uncomfortable with how I saw certain translations being done here, where it was like, okay, we're going to have the Korean translator do the very accurate technical translation, but then we'll bring in this Westerner to make it sound good or to make it creative. And it's like, it's problematic. And do they both get called translators? Or is that something else entirely? Ooh, that's a tangent. I was really trying to tell myself, don't go on crazy tangents, but here I am.
The more tangents, the merrier. There is another person with a hand raised, I'm told, and we're nearing the end, so we definitely want to get in as many questions as possible.
Hi. So actually, what you're discussing right now kind of leads into my question, which was, how do you go about, I guess, choosing who would be your co-translator, in the sense that when you write, when you have a written work, there's a certain voice that a person who reads can hear, when they're reading a book that's been translated. And it's interesting because you touched upon this before when you were saying that you had a book that you were working on, but it was gonna be due right when you were due yourself. Congratulations, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.
And so I thought to myself, so whose voice is the final voice on the written work, and how do you decide that, and how do you go about working with someone so that it stays cohesive in someone's mind as they read it?
Yeah, it's also a really good question. So starting out, I had sort of a list of criteria for how I was looking for co-translators. I was looking for somebody so the 3 criteria were, they had to have some background in that source material. So like with the science fiction project, when I approached Chungmin about it, even though she was very new to fiction, she had done a lot of nonfiction, lots of nonfiction translation, including science translation. And so I thought, oh, maybe this will work because there's bound to be some science in the book, right? She wanted to get into literary translation, but did not have any books on her CV other than nonfiction. And so it was sort of a 2-part thing of, is the skill set there, and do they need this opportunity? Can they use the leg up? And so that was how I approached it there. With the autobiography, it was trickier, mostly because of just the sheer size of the book. There were multiple translators who I approached, mostly people, actually, I think it was the same criteria there. I was looking for a co-translator who had experience with history translation, but likewise wanted to break into lit translation and didn't have it on their CV or didn't have the connections yet. But the size of the project made it really difficult. It's really hard to hand a 1,000-page book to a brand new translator and say, go to town, especially when I wasn't there to work with them for the first few months. I knew that I was going to have to come in late. And so I ended up working with someone who was a much more experienced translator and didn't need that leg up. And the interesting thing is it was a very quick translation, given the length. It was much more expedient, but we didn't have as much sort of back and forth through the project. It was kind of like they did their part, I came and I did my part. And then it was pretty much done. So yeah, so it was interesting to see where that went. I don't know if I answered your question, but like I said, it was a balance of my first concern was, do they have the skill set to do this? Because I wasn't going to just hand a project to someone that wasn't ready for it. And then the big one for me was, again, like, how can I bring someone else into the industry? Because it's very hard to get your first break.
So we're at the 5-minute warning. There's one last question that everybody's going to get, but maybe we can squeeze in one more audience question if, yeah? Okay. Yeah. We got the nod from Sora, so fire away.
So Anna asks, why would localization, in parentheses, what I think you were referring to as more creative or mechanical maybe, close parentheses, why would localization not be considered translation?
Well, I mean, I guess the conclusion I arrived at is that I guess it would not be translation if the person is not looking at the source text at all, if they're doing it solely as an edit of the English. So they receive it as an English text and edit it as an English text. Whereas as a translator, when I'm editing as a translator, I'm always going back to the source language and looking at what's there. And then that informs my edits, as opposed to saying like as opposed to purely thinking about what sounds good or looks good in English. But it's a weird line. It's very fuzzy. And like when I work with editors, they might be asking me questions about the source text that then informs how they edit. So I don't know. I guess that's the big question is, should we consider localization or editing or creative editing translation, even if the source text is not involved? There certainly have been cases where it is called translation, but it's fraught. It's problematic.
So I don't know. I think we're going to need to move to the closing question. I know there are a few more outstanding questions from attendees. So maybe, Sean, can you put the email address into the chat so people could send them in there, and maybe if they're addressed to Sora, maybe Sora could answer them later, or one of us could, yeah. So the final question, which we pose to everybody who comes and conducts a clinic with us, is what would an ideal future of literary translation look like to you?
So that's a really good question. I have a two-part answer, and maybe one part I'll focus on because I think will address one of these very last questions that popped up in the window. When you first told me about this question, I had sort of a general thing about seeing like, I guess like racial equity realized in translation, which is a very vague answer. And then the Andrea Gorman thing happened. I was like, maybe I should be more specific about what I mean by this. And so then I was trying to formulate my answer there. And then this shooting happened in Atlanta. Now I'm kind of just, my mind is everywhere. And I was trying to craft an answer and realized I'm not quite ready to read out what I have for that. So I guess the short version is for my ideal future of translation, I know that there are those of us of Asian descent who don't always feel at home in these places, or who are challenged on what we're doing here. And it all has to do with this idea. I mentioned the idea of like with bridge translation, and this is very vague, and I'm trying to sort of pull these thoughts together, but there's this thing around being a person of Asian descent and the language that you speak and the language of being like an authentic speaker of a language. And so my ideal future would be that is just not an issue anymore. So I'll pause there. That's part of my answer. Maybe I'll write a much more coherent essay about it at some point. My other part of this, so one of the questions came up about translating as a mom. The other thing I had thought about, so the whole thing with these co-translations, it came up because I was becoming a mom and trying to figure out how can I still be a translator while also being a mom. And I had hoped that co-translation would be a way to do so. And I think like with my partnership with Changmi, and I think part of why it worked as well as it did is because she's also a mom. And so she understood what the challenges were that I was facing. But my ideal future would be one where I'm not asking myself whether I have to choose, or worrying about, am I paying enough attention to my kid? Am I not paying enough attention to my work? So I don't know how to get there, but that would be my ideal, is where I can be a mom and a translator and not wonder if I need to just quit working or stuff the kid in a closet. So, yeah, I hope that made sense.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sora.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, tonight for joining us. Thank you again to the Center for Fiction for hosting these clinics. These clinics are taking place the third Thursday of every month. Please sign up to be notified of upcoming events. Next month in April, Madhu Kaza and Jeremy Chiang will be discussing translation as a form of creative writing and the ways in which working on original fiction, nonfiction, and plays making translation can mutually inform creative practice. The registration link is in the chat, or it should be in a second, and on the Center for Fiction's website. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. So please, everybody, stay safe. And I just want to personally thank Sora again. And yeah, thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure to be here with you tonight.